What's up everybody, Nate here. So today I want to kind of give my thoughts and reactions on Dave Ramsey and what he just said about the housing market. Essentially, Dave Ramsey believes that right now in 2022 is the absolute best time to buy a house and that prices are not going to go down. So I want to kind of go over what he means and give a whole lot more context to what's happening in the housing market right now, and answer is right now the best time to purchase a home. So in case you don't know who Dave Ramsey is, here's a small background. So Dave Ramsey hosts the Dave Ramsey Show. It's a podcast where he basically goes on and gives financial teachings, talks about getting out of debt, and talks about how people can start making money in 2022. He is one of the most outspoken financial educators and financial figures in the business and financial world today. Now, with that being said, he is completely wrong about the housing market, and here's why. I watched a video from Dave Ramsey where he was discussing the housing market, and he said that right now is the best time to buy a house because prices in the housing market are never going to come back down. Even though mortgage rates are rising, he believes that prices are only going to go up in the future. So he says if you don't buy a house right now, you are going to be paying a whole lot more 5 years from now. It doesn't make any difference if mortgage rates are going up because housing prices are at their lowest point. If you wait 5 years from now, well, you might get a lower interest rate, but you possibly are going to spend way more for that particular house. Now, let's kind of break all of this down. So what he's basically discussing here is the basic principle of supply and demand and how it affects the housing market. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a whole lot of demand in the housing market and very little supply. It didn't start out this way though. Because of stimulus and super low interest rates in response to the pandemic, well, that meant that millions of Americans could finally afford to get into a home at a really affordable level. Things hadn't really exploded yet in 2020, and I was one of the lucky few individuals to actually buy a home before everything kind of exploded in 2020 and the early parts of 2022. With all of this stimulus and low interest rates, so many people bought so many homes that there just wasn't as many homes on the market to support all of that demand. It's important to know here that there's pretty much never an equilibrium in the housing market. That's why home values go up so much, is because there's way more people that want a home in the United States than the inventory that is available. It's usually pretty close. Home values typically don't go up like we have seen in 2020 and in 2021 though. Over those 2 years, some say that home values went up by around 30% or more. Typically, home values only rise by around 2 to 5%. But because there's been so much money and because of overinflated everything and markets hitting record highs, everything has gone up, and that has included the housing market. In 2022 though, everything is kind of slowing down, from the stock market to the cryptocurrency market and of course the housing market. You are starting to see a situation where demand is getting lower and lower because the Federal Reserve is raising its interest rates faster and more aggressively than they pretty much ever have in American history in order to combat inflation. That means that demand, like I said, is getting sucked out of the housing market, and you have some time for supply to begin growing. More people are putting their house on the market. More homes available means the prices of current homes can come down because you just have more sellers than there is buyers. Now, we're not quite to a point where there is so many more sellers than there is buyers, but we are getting back to that point of equilibrium in the United States. Now, here is why Dave Ramsey is completely wrong about the housing market in 2022. He says that right now is one of the best times to buy a home despite rising interest rates. However, I would completely disagree with this because home prices are still setting record highs. So we have a situation right now where, yes, demand is starting to come down and home prices in certain markets are also starting to come down a little bit. This is because supply is coming up. But the situation that you have right now, though, is that people who are able to purchase a home can also afford those outlandish prices. Home prices are still near their record highs, and mortgage rates are going way up. Mortgage rates in the United States for a 30-year fixed mortgage recently crossed 6 and maybe even 7%. much higher than the 1 to 3% that they were back at the start of the pandemic. So with interest rates going up so high, that means that Americans are now going to have to pay hundreds of additional dollars on their mortgage every single month just to live in that house, simply because the Fed is making it harder for banks and financial institutions to borrow money. In 2022, you are going to pay a ton for a house. you are going to pay that overinflated price. You are also going to pay that overinflated interest rate. So you are paying all of this money more than you would over the last 2 years. Now, Dave Ramsey's argument is that, yeah, this is all true, but you're probably going to pay more in 2023 and in 2024. This is not necessarily true. Now, while I don't believe that we're going to see an outright housing market crash, housing prices could eventually cool off and go down in the United States depending on what happens and if we run into a recession. First and foremost, Americans need to be able to afford a home. So that is part of the reason why home prices and home values have skyrocketed over the last few decades. As incomes go up, Americans have a lot more money to buy a house. However, wages have been pretty stagnant in 2022, so Americans are not having that additional income in order to buy a home. So that is one thing to consider. And the other thing you need to consider is insurance, taxes, and inflation. Inflation is rising at an over 40-year high right now, which means everything else in our society costs a whole lot more than it did in 2020 and in 2021. A lot of those costs Americans simply can't avoid. Other bills like credit cards and gas prices are getting way too high, and Americans don't have a choice. They have to foot the bill because if they want to commute to work, if they have a job they have to go to, then they have to pay higher gas prices. And of course, other bills like loans and credit cards, they have to pay those debts off too. So those things are getting a lot more expensive. Not only that, but Americans that bought a home over the last 2 years are now getting hit with huge property tax bills because taxes are rising in the United States as the values of homes go up. And you have to pay more insurance because as the value goes up, you now have a lot more home to insure, so your insurance payment grows too. All of that kind of adds to the cost of owning a home. And if millions of Americans suddenly can't afford their home because of taxes, insurance, and inflation going way up and continuing to set record highs, well, what do? They have a few options. They can sell their home or they can go into foreclosure. I mean, Americans can find other ways to make money, but the stock market isn't really going up and giving those gains like we saw in 2021. Neither is real estate, neither is commodities and cryptocurrency. So investing in the short term to get a lot of those gains is pretty much out for a lot of Americans. In addition, the jobs market is super tight, so going out and getting a job that pays you a whole lot more is also going to be very difficult. Businesses don't have a lot of money to give out to employees right now, so where are Americans going to get this extra money? They simply don't have it. So we could see a massive foreclosure crisis in 2022 and beyond. Millions of Americans that either can't afford their home but don't want to move, or have to sell their property. And if we start to see millions of homes put on the market all at once because inflation is getting too high and taxes are going up too high as well, then that could mean that inventory is outpacing demand as interest rates stay high and stimulus disappears. That means we could see housing prices come way down over the next couple of years, basically completely disproving Dave Ramsey. Now, you might be thinking, Nate, this is not going to happen, but the likelihood of this happening is getting bigger and bigger every single day as the Fed battles inflation, as we have huge supply chain issues and a recession possibly around the corner. A recession means a complete reset of our economy, and it means we're probably going to see unemployment go up, meaning that people who have jobs might not have them in a year from now. All of this tightening from the Federal Reserve and less money circulating means that inflation will hopefully start to come back down, but that is a big if. The Federal Reserve has admitted that they can't do anything about rising food prices and with our supply chains and of course with energy prices. Because of that, Americans are spending most of their money on those things. And if those prices continue to go up, well, that is a problem for everybody. The Federal Reserve wants to have a soft landing for our economy. So they want to raise interest rates, they want to bring down demand just enough so that way we avoid a recession. But they admitted at a recent meeting that this is going to be very difficult and that a recession is definitely possible in 2022 or in 2023. They have very limited tools. They can bring down demand, but they can't fix our supply chains. And with inflation still coming from all of that, you are going to run into a situation where interest rates are growing. So credit card debt and loans and mortgages are going to be very hard to come by, all while supply starts to grow as less Americans can afford their home and fewer Americans can simply buy a home. So is right now the best time to buy a home? I would argue no. You're probably going to overpay for a home right now, and more than likely, home prices are going to come down. Like I said, it is an if we're going to see a massive foreclosure crisis. It really just depends on what inflation does. As of right now, inflation continues to go up. It could eventually come back down, and our supply chains could get a whole lot better, meaning Dave Ramsey at that point would be right. Home prices are just going to go up if all of that happens, and eventually the Federal Reserve will lower interest rates, and at that point, if you were to buy a house right now, you could eventually refinance. But his scenario is also a big if too. We just don't know what's going to happen with the housing market, and like I said, it really all just depends on inflation and what the Federal Reserve does in the future. I would like to believe that housing prices are going to come down a little bit in time. Overall, the real estate market and the housing market is going to go back up. All these problems that we're facing, whether it's inflation or supply chain issues or a possible recession, they are eventually going to go away, and our economy will be reset where supply and demand for everything is going to be in near equilibrium. That means everything can go back to what it was before, and spending and consumer buying habits will also be very similar to what they were pre-pandemic. It's going to take a few years to do that though. So in the meantime, interest rates are going up, inflation is just getting worse, and it's even harder for Americans to take on a whole lot of debt. They have to be careful because wages aren't going up either. So like I said before, that home affordability is getting even harder and basically disappearing. So I don't really have a direct answer for you on when the best time and the next best time to buy a house is going to be. We're going to have to look at the housing market, but I would anticipate that things are going to cool off within the next 6 months to a year, making housing prices come down just a little bit and growing demand and inventory enough to reach an equilibrium. But what I can tell you is that Dave Ramsey is wrong about the housing market. Right now is not the best time to buy a home in the United States. Truly, the best time was at the beginning of the pandemic, all the way back in March of 2020. But now I want to hear from you on this issue. What do you think about the housing market in 2022? And more importantly, what do you think about Dave Ramsey's thoughts about the housing market? Do you think right now is the best time to buy a home, or do you think it's the worst time and a better time is going to be within the next 6 months to a year in 2023? Whatever your thoughts are, leave a comment below before you go. But that is it for today's business and financial news breakdown. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to stay up to date with all the top business and financial news from around the country, our team puts together a free daily newsletter, and you can subscribe to it by clicking the link in this corner right here. And if you want to stay up to date with me and everything else happening in the business and financial world, I'm putting out updates 7 days a week over here on this channel, and I've actually got another one ready for you right here, so be sure to check that out before you go. That is it for me, everybody. Be kind out there, and I'll see you all in the next one.